The first time I saw a man's faith truly break, I was cleaning the vomit from the confessional booth. This was my 3rd year serving the Cathedral of Endless Martyrdom on Griffon the 7th, and I had learned that doubt came out in many ways. Sometimes it was tears, sometimes silence. This time, it was the acidic stench of partially digested protein paste splattered across the wooden lattice that separated supplicant from confessor. I was 26 years old, newly ordained, and I believed with absolute certainty that the Emperor's light could burn away any shadow. The man who had vomited a manufactorum overseer named Kellen had confessed to falsifying production reports. The punishment would be servo-skull lobotomy. He knew it. I knew it. The Emperor knew it. What I didn't know yet, scrubbing that booth with industrial solvent while my knees ached against the stone floor, was that Kellen would be the first of many whose faith I would watch collapse like a building with its foundation removed. The cathedral stood in Hive Tertius, one of 17 hives that pierced Griffon the 7th's rust-red sky like the broken teeth of some ancient beast. Our particular district served approximately 4 million souls, though the Administratum census data was always 3 decades behind reality. Cardinal Voss oversaw our operations with the kind of distant efficiency a man might use to manage a particularly tedious filing system. He was 73 years old, augmented to the point where more of him was machinery than flesh, and he had overseen this cathedral for 42 years without ever displaying anything resembling warmth. I learned quickly that this was not cruelty, but practicality. We processed 17,000 confessions monthly. We performed 2,300 marriages, 800 funerals, and approximately 12,000 individual blessings, prayer sessions, and ritual cleansings. The math was simple. Efficiency demanded emotional distance. Compassion was a luxury we could not afford. My days began at 4 in the morning with the Litany of Dawn. The words came automatically after the first month 78 verses, praising the Emperor's eternal vigilance, his golden throne, his sacrifice for humanity. I would recite them in the cold darkness of my cell, a room exactly 2 meters by 3 meters, containing a cot, a water basin, and a small shrine carved into the stone wall. The shrine held a finger bone, allegedly from Saint Celestine, though I suspected every junior priest in the Imperium possessed an identical relic of dubious provenance. Still, I kissed it each morning and each night. Faith, I had been taught, required commitment to ritual especially when evidence was absent. By 4:30, I would be in the main chapel for communal prayers with the other junior clergy. There were 18 of us, ranging from fresh-faced 22-year-olds to grizzled 40-year veterans who had somehow avoided promotion. We knelt on stone worn smooth by centuries of knees, our breath forming clouds in the unheated air, and we prayed until 6 o'clock when the first supplicants would arrive. The people came in waves. First were the factory workers, stopping before their shifts to beg the Emperor's protection against industrial accidents. They would press their foreheads to the blessed icons by the entrance, kiss the Aquila medallions hanging from chains, and drop whatever coins they could spare into the collection servitors. Most couldn't spare any. I would bless them anyway, making the sign of the Aquila over their bowed heads, feeling the weight of their desperate hope like a physical pressure against my chest. Then came the administratum clerks, the mid-hive merchants, the schoolchildren herded in by stern-faced teachers. Each group had its designated time slot, its specific prayer cycle, its particular needs. By noon, I would have blessed 400 people, heard 27 confessions, and administered communion to 112 supplicants. My voice would be hoarse. My knees would throb. The incense smoke that filled the cathedral constantly would have worked its way deep into my lungs until I tasted nothing but frankincense and sacred oils. But there was something else too. Something I noticed in those early years that I couldn't quite articulate. A pattern in the confessions. Kellen and his falsified reports was not unique. Every week, someone would confess to similar crimes, production shortfalls covered up, quality standards ignored, safety protocols circumvented, and every week, I would assign the standard penances, flagellation, extended prayer vigils, monetary donations to the cathedral coffers. But the crimes never stopped. If anything, they intensified. By my 4th year of service, I was hearing confessions about entire assembly lines producing defective ammunition, about toxic coolant dumped into water supplies, about forced overtime that left workers collapsing at their stations. The math began to trouble me. If our district served 4 million people, and we heard these confessions weekly, what did that say about the actual state of our hive? What did it say about the Imperium itself? I made the mistake of raising this concern with Father Matthias during our weekly supervision session. He was 67, a senior priest who had mentored me since my arrival, a man with kind eyes and hands that shook from neural damage sustained during a penitent's violent breakdown years ago. We sat in his office, a cramped space filled with scrolls and data slates, while outside the stained glass windows the hive's endless machinery ground away at reality itself. I told him what I had observed. I told him I feared we were treating symptoms rather than diseases. I told him, and this was my greatest error, that perhaps the system itself was flawed. Matthias listened without interrupting. When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment. Then he stood, walked to his window, and stared out at the hivescape. "How many people do you think we save, brother?" he asked. "I don't understand," I said. "Every day," he continued, still facing the window, "we offer hope to people who have none. We provide structure to lives that would otherwise be chaos. We give meaning to suffering. Do you understand what would happen if we stopped?" I didn't answer. "They would tear each other apart," he said quietly. "Not in years, not in months, in days, perhaps hours. The Imperium is not a perfect system, brother. It is simply the only system that allows humanity to survive. Your doubt," he turned to face me then, and his kind eyes were infinitely sad, "is a luxury we cannot afford." He reported me to Cardinal Voss that same evening. The Cardinal's office occupied the cathedral's highest tower, a space that seemed designed to emphasize the distance between divine authority and mortal concerns. I was summoned 3 days after my conversation with Matthias. The climb took 40 minutes, up spiral staircases worn concave by centuries of feet, past levels devoted to archives, armories, living quarters for senior clergy. By the time I reached the Cardinal's door, I was breathing hard and my legs burned. A servo skull admitted me no words, just a flash of its optical sensors and the pneumatic hiss of the door mechanism. Inside, Cardinal Voss sat behind a desk carved from a single piece of black stone, polished until it reflected the room's dim lighting like still water. His augmetic eyes clicked and whirred as I entered, focusing on me with an intensity that made my skin prickle. "Sit," he said. His voice was a synthesized whisper, barely audible above the cathedral's omnipresent mechanical hum. I sat. "Father Matthias informs me you have developed concerns about the efficacy of our ministry," Voss said. It was not a question. I expressed doubts, I admitted. There seemed no point in lying to a man whose augmetic eyes could probably detect my pulse rate. "Doubts," Voss repeated. He leaned back in his chair, which adjusted automatically to accommodate his posture. "Tell me, brother, do you know why we maintain 17,000 confession slots per month? To serve the spiritual needs of our congregation." "Wrong." The word cracked like a whip. "We maintain 17,000 confession slots because that is the maximum number we can process while maintaining a 93% compliance rate with ecclesiarchal efficiency standards. If we processed fewer, we would be flagged for investigation. If we processed more, we would require additional resources we cannot justify. The number is not about need, it is about quota." I must have looked shocked because one corner of his mouth twitched in what might have been amusement. "You are wondering if I care about their souls," he said. "The answer is yes, but I care more about maintaining social order. The Imperium requires faith not because the Emperor demands worship, though he does, but because faith is the binding agent that holds chaos at bay. Your confessional booth is not a place of spiritual healing, brother. It is a pressure valve. Do you understand?" "I think so," I whispered. No, Voss said. You don't. But you will. Father Matthias has recommended a special assignment for you. Something to broaden your perspective. Report to the Penitent Processing Center tomorrow at dawn. Dismissed. I left his office with my hands shaking and a cold knot of dread in my stomach that I couldn't explain. That night, I dreamed of the confessional booth filled with vomit, except this time when I opened the door to clean it, I found the booth had no back wall, just an infinite darkness that smelled of copper and decay. The Penitent Processing Center occupied the cathedral's sublevels, carved directly into the hive's bedrock. I had never been below the main worship floors before. The descent took nearly an hour, down maintenance shafts and service corridors, past levels where the air grew progressively colder and damper and thick with smells I couldn't identify. My guide was a silent servo skull that led me through a maze of passages until we emerged into a vast chamber lit by harsh lumens that cast no shadows. The space was divided into rows of cells, hundreds of them, maybe thousands, stretching away into the distance until the lumen's light failed. Each cell was 2 meters square, fronted with reinforced bars, and each cell contained a person. Father Cassius ran the facility. He was younger than I expected, perhaps 40, with the lean build of someone who had spent years in austere conditions. His face bore the ritual scarification of the Redemptionist sect, a series of fine cuts forming the Aquila symbol across his forehead and cheeks. When he smiled in greeting, I noticed several of his teeth were missing. "Brother," he said warmly, "welcome to the Emperor's mercy." "These are all penitents?" I asked, staring at the rows of cells. "Every soul here has confessed to crimes against the Emperor's law," Cassius confirmed. "Heresy, mostly, some sedition, a few cases of prohibited knowledge. Your Cardinal believes you would benefit from understanding the consequences of unchecked doubt." He led me down the main corridor between the cells. The prisoners watched us pass, some with fear, some with defiance, most with the blank stare of broken spirits. A woman in one cell pressed her face against the bars and begged for mercy in a language I didn't recognize. A man in another cell sat perfectly still, his eyes fixed on some point in middle distance, his lips moving in silent prayer or madness. The smell was overwhelming human waste, sweat, fear, and underneath it all something like spoiled meat. "How long do they stay here?" I asked. "Until their penance is complete," Cassius said. "Some achieve grace within months. Others," he shrugged. "The Emperor tests us all differently." "And after?" I pressed. "Most become servitors," he said simply. "It's a mercy, really. They transcend their failures and serve the Imperium in purity of purpose. No more doubt, no more questioning, just service." We stopped at a cell deeper in the facility where a man sat cross-legged on the floor. He might have been 30 or 60, impossible to tell given his emaciation. His head was shaved, his body bore the marks of repeated flagellation, and his hands were bound in prayer position with wire that had cut into his wrists. "This is Brother Yakov," Cassius said. "He was a priest, like you." I stared at the man. He didn't look up. "What was his crime?" I asked quietly. "He questioned the Ecclesiarchy's resource allocation," Cassius said. "Specifically, he calculated that the tithes collected from his district could feed every citizen adequately if distributed efficiently, rather than being sent off-world. He presented this information to his Cardinal. He believed he was serving the Emperor's will by highlighting the suffering of the faithful." "When was he imprisoned?" 14 years ago. The number hit me like a physical blow. 14 years? "His penance is proving challenging," Cassius said. "He maintains that his calculations were correct. He insists he was trying to help. This is the nature of intellectual pride, brother. The most dangerous heresy is the one that believes it serves the Emperor." I looked at Yakov again. His lips were moving. I leaned closer to hear. "Could have fed them all," he was whispering. The math was simple. Could have fed them all. Could have. "He says that constantly," Cassius noted. "For 14 years. The same words, over and over. We've tried everything: sensory deprivation, enhanced interrogation, pharmacological intervention. Nothing breaks the cycle. Some sins dig too deep to root out. Wouldn't servitor conversion be more merciful? I asked. Cassius smiled sadly. He hasn't confessed. True confession requires the penitent to renounce their heresy. Brother Yakov still believes he was right. Until that changes, conversion would be premature. The Emperor's mercy requires the soul's cooperation. We left Yakov to his whispered calculations and continued through the facility. Cassius showed me the interrogation chambers where confessors work to extract true contrition. He showed me the meditation cells where penitents spent months in sensory deprivation. He showed me the surgical preparation rooms where the truly penitent were prepared for their final service, as servitors' skulls marked for opening, bodies measured for augmetic integration, prayers inscribed on flesh that would soon be neither living nor dead. By the time we returned to the main chamber, I felt hollowed out, scraped clean of something I couldn't name. Your assignment, Cassius said, is to work here 3 days per week. You will assist in the extraction of confessions and the administration of penance. Cardinal Voss believes this will help you understand the importance of maintaining faith without question. I understand, I said, though I wasn't sure I did. Good, Cassius said. One more thing, brother. Every priest who serves here undergoes a nightly ritual. Come. He led me to a small chapel off the main chamber. Inside, the walls were covered with names, thousands upon thousands of names, inscribed in tiny script that covered every surface from floor to ceiling. They spiraled up into the darkness above the lumen's reach, names upon names upon names. Every penitent who has passed through this facility, Cassius explained. We inscribe their names here as a reminder. The Emperor remembers every soul, even those who fall, especially those who fall. He handed me a stylus. You will add to this record as you serve, and every night you will kneel here and read names until the hour is complete. Never fewer than 100, never more than 200. This is how we remember that every soul we process was once a person with hopes and fears and faith that failed them. I took the stylus with numb fingers. The weight of those names pressed down on me like a physical force. How many? Tens of thousands? Hundreds of thousands? How old is this facility? I whispered. Ancient, Cassius said. The records suggest it was established shortly after the hive's founding, approximately 8,000 years ago. We calculate roughly 12 million souls have been processed here. Of course, the walls can't hold all the names. We scrape them away periodically and start fresh. The Emperor remembers, even if we cannot. That night, I knelt in the chapel of names and read. Jaqen Vors, Melissa then, Cromwell Ninefinger, Yasimdel. Names without faces, faces without stories, stories ground down to mere data points in the Imperium's infinite ledger. When my hour was complete, I stumbled back to my cell in the cathedral proper and lay awake until dawn, unable to close my eyes without seeing Brother Yakov's lips moving in their endless loop of mathematical damnation. My first confession extraction happened on my 3rd day in the facility. The penitent was a woman named Sarah, 42 years old, charged with spreading seditious materials. Specifically, she had distributed pamphlets questioning the necessity of child tithes to the Schola Progenium. Her own daughter had been taken 3 years prior. The pamphlets asked simple questions. Why must the children be taken so young? Could they not serve the Emperor equally well if allowed to remain with their families until adolescence? What happened to the children who failed the scholars' selection process? Dangerous questions. Questions that implied the Imperium's systems might be examined, questioned, potentially reformed. I sat across from Sarah in a bare interrogation cell. Between us was a table bolted to the floor. Her hands were manacled to an iron ring. She watched me with eyes that held neither hope nor fear, just a kind of exhausted patience, as if she had been waiting for this moment and was almost relieved it had finally arrived. The Emperor protects, I said, beginning the ritual phrases. The Emperor protects, she echoed dutifully. You are accused of heresy against the Ministorum and sedition against Imperial law, I continued. Do you confess? I distributed the pamphlets, she said. That much is fact. Do you renounce the heresy they contained? She was quiet for a long moment. Then, I only wanted to know what happened to my daughter. The Schola Progenium serves the Emperor's will, I said, reciting the approved response. Your daughter serves in ways we cannot fathom. This is the highest honor. She was 7 years old, Sarah said softly. She still had her milk teeth. She was afraid of the dark. I used to hold her when she cried at night. She looked up at me. Tell me, priest, do you have children? The clergy are forbidden. I know, she interrupted. But imagine for a moment that you did. Imagine a child who depends on you for everything. Food, warmth, safety, love. Now imagine men in uniforms taking that child away while she screams for you. Imagine being told you should be grateful for this honor. Imagine not even being allowed to know if she lives or dies. The Emperor's plan. I don't want to hear about the Emperor's plan, Sarah said, and her voice hardened. I want to hear you tell me it was necessary. I want to hear you explain why a 7-year-old girl's terror serves the Imperium better than a lifetime of loyal service from a grateful, intact family. Can you do that, priest? Can you make me understand? I opened my mouth to deliver the approved catechism. The words caught in my throat. Instead, I heard myself say, "No." Sarah smiled sadly. "Then we understand each other. You must confess," I said, desperate now. "You must renounce the heresy. If you don't, I know what happens if I don't," she said. "Father Cassius has explained it thoroughly. But I cannot confess to a heresy I don't believe I committed. I love my daughter. I questioned a system that took her from me. If that is heresy, then the word has lost all meaning." I left that interrogation shaking and reported my failure to Cassius. He nodded as if he had expected this outcome. "She won't confess," he said. "Some never do. We'll continue the process. Eventually, the body breaks even if the mind refuses. The servitor conversion will proceed regardless. It's simply a question of whether she enters it with grace or without." "How long?" I asked. "Until she starves," Cassius said simply, "or until her mind shatters from isolation. Usually 2 to 3 years. The Emperor is patient." I returned to Sarah's cell many times over the following months. Our conversations followed a similar pattern. I would beg her to confess. She would refuse. We would sit in silence until my allotted time expired. But gradually, I began to notice changes. She grew thinner, her eyes developing the hollow look of someone being slowly erased. Her questions about her daughter became less specific, more abstract. Where initially she would ask, "Is Tessa alive?" she began to ask, "What happens to them?" And eventually, "Did I have a daughter?" Her grip on her own story was slipping, worn away by isolation and deprivation like water eroding stone. By the 8th month, she no longer recognized me when I entered her cell. By the 10th, she no longer spoke at all. By the 12th, she was transferred to surgical preparation. I inscribed her name in the Chapel of Names with hands that trembled so badly I could barely form the letters. Sarah Vaughan, mother, heretic, servitor. But Sarah was only one of dozens I processed. There was Magistrate Kellis, who had documented evidence of corruption in the administratum and was now slowly going blind in his cell side effect of contaminated water. Cassius explained, unfortunate but unavoidable given resource constraints. There was Tech Adept Varro, who had questioned whether certain maintenance rituals were actually necessary or merely traditional, now subjected to daily sessions where his precious technical knowledge was systematically extracted before his conversion. There was teacher Yana, who had taught her students to think critically, now broken by a simple method. Every day they brought her one of her former students, also imprisoned for heresy, learned at her knee, and made her watch their interrogations. I learned the mathematics of breaking faith. It took, on average, 18 months to extract a true confession from someone who genuinely believed they were innocent. Sensory deprivation accelerated the process. Sleep disruption helped. Isolation was essential. But the most effective method was the simplest: time. Given enough time, anyone would confess to anything. The human mind was not designed to maintain coherent narrative against sustained assault. Memory became unreliable. Identity became fluid. Truth became whatever stopped the suffering. And every night, I knelt in the chapel of names and read. 100 minimum. Never more than 200. Names scrolling past like a river of the damned. I began to recognize patterns in the names, family names, that appeared multiple times, suggesting whole bloodlines purged. Regional clustering that hinted at district-wide heresy purges. Temporal bunching that corresponded to political upheavals or resource crises. The names told stories of their own, if you knew how to read them. It was during one of these nightly vigils, approximately 2 years into my service in the facility, that I noticed something strange. I was reading names from approximately 400 years ago when I came across an entry that made me stop. Priest Malcolm Voss. The family name was not common. I pulled the facility's historical records, ancient data slates, that required special permission to access, and confirmed what I suspected. Priest Malcolm Voss had been processed through this facility for the crime of suggesting theological reforms contrary to established doctrine. He had served 9 years of penance before accepting servitor conversion. He was Cardinal Voss's ancestor, perhaps great-great-grandfather. The records were unclear. The Cardinal knew. He had to know. His own bloodline bore the stain of processed heresy. And yet he ran the cathedral with the same cold efficiency, maintained the same systems that had destroyed his own ancestor. I sat in that chapel, surrounded by names, and felt something fundamental crack inside my chest. It wasn't faith-breaking, not yet. It was something worse. It was understanding. The system didn't care about truth. It didn't care about justice. It didn't even care about faith. Not really. It cared about perpetuation. The Imperium was a machine that consumed human lives and human souls, and transformed them into the fuel that kept the machine running. We were not servants of the Emperor. We were servants of the machine, and the machine was very, very good at its function. I continued my dual service: 3 days in the Penitent facility, 4 days in the cathedral proper, hearing confessions and administering blessings, and performing the 1,000 small rituals that kept the faithful faithful. But something had changed in how I heard the confessions. When Kellen no, a different Kellen, there were always Kellens confessed to falsifying production reports. I no longer heard a man confessing sin. I heard a man reporting for processing. When the factory workers begged the Emperor's protection, I no longer heard prayers. I heard the desperate noises of animals caught in a trap they couldn't see. Father Matthias noticed the change. We had stopped having supervision sessions after my assignment to the facility, but he cornered me one day in the cathedral scriptorium, where I was inscribing liturgical texts, another element of my duties, the endless copying and recopying of prayers that had been copied for 10,000 years. "You've lost something," he said without preamble. I didn't look up from my work. "What have I lost?" "The light," he said. "When you first arrived, you had it. That shine young priests have, the absolute certainty that what we do matters. It's gone now." "Perhaps I learned better," I said. Matthias was quiet for a moment. Then he sat down across from me, his shaking hands folded on the table between us. "I'm sorry," he said. "For what?" "For reporting you to Voss. For recommending your assignment to the facility. I thought." He paused. "I thought it would help you understand. Instead, I think I broke something in you." "You didn't break me," I said. "You showed me what was already broken." "The system," he began. "The system is a machine for processing human souls into compliance," I interrupted. "It doesn't matter if they're guilty or innocent. It doesn't matter if their questions are reasonable or heretical. What matters is that they confess, because confession is the point. Not justice, not truth, just confession." "You're wrong," Matthias said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Am I?" I set down my stylus. How many people have you shepherded to the Penitent facility over your career? How many confessions have you extracted that you knew were false? How many times have you blessed someone knowing they would be dead within days? He didn't answer. That's what I thought, I said. I returned to my inscription work. After a moment, Matthias stood and left without another word. That night, I committed my first act of heresy. It was small, almost meaningless. I was inscribing the Litany of Eternal Service, a text I had copied at least 40 times, when I deliberately changed a word. Where the text should have read, "The Emperor's will is absolute and cannot be questioned," I wrote, "The Emperor's will is absolute and must be questioned." One word, a single substitution that inverted the meaning entirely. I stared at what I had written, waiting for some reaction, divine judgment, internal horror, the compulsion to correct my error. Nothing came. The words sat on the page, black ink on yellow parchment, indistinguishable from the thousands of other words I had inscribed. No angels descended to smite me. No servo skulls detected the alteration. The universe remained indifferent to my small rebellion, so I did it again. And again. Little changes, scattered through texts I knew would be filed away unread in the cathedral's vast archives. Cannot be questioned became must be questioned. Faithful unto death became faithful until thought. The Emperor protects became the Emperor expects. Tiny mutations in the great genetic code of Imperial doctrine. Would anyone ever read them? Almost certainly not. Did it matter? I didn't know. But it was something. A record that someone had noticed. Someone had objected. Someone had tried, however futilely, to introduce doubt into the great unquestionable machine. I began to test other boundaries. When hearing confessions, I would occasionally assign penances that made no sense, telling a man who confessed to blasphemy to recite the Litany of Hope rather than the standard Litany of Contrition. When blessing the factory workers, I would sometimes include phrases from banned texts, fragments of pre-imperial philosophy or forbidden theology, slipped so subtly into the ritual prayers that no one noticed. I was sabotaging the machine, microscopically, uselessly. But I was doing something. Then I made a mistake. Or perhaps it was deliberate. I'm still not certain. I was conducting a confession with a woman named Petra, a mid-hive merchant accused of harboring sympathies for the Tau Empire. The charges were absurd. She had simply argued that the Tau's approach to trade might offer some lessons for imperial commerce. This was enough to mark her for investigation. She sat across from me in the confessional booth, that small wooden box that had seen so many souls processed, and she wept while reciting her confession. It was clearly coerced, clearly false. She didn't believe a word she was saying. "The Emperor protects," I said when she finished. "The Emperor protects." She echoed automatically. And then, instead of assigning her penance, I said, "You don't have to do this." She stopped crying, looked up at me through the lattice. "What? You don't have to confess to things you don't believe," I said. "The system requires your compliance, but you can refuse. They'll punish you regardless. Your confession doesn't actually change anything." "I don't understand," she whispered. "I know," I said. "Neither do I. Not really. But I'm tired of watching people break themselves for a system that doesn't care if they're innocent or guilty. Just," I paused, searching for words, "just know that someone heard you. Someone knows you didn't mean it. That has to count for something." Petra stared at me for a long moment. Then she leaned close to the lattice and whispered, "Are you trying to save me or damn me, priest?" "I don't know the difference anymore," I admitted. She left the booth without receiving formal absolution. I sat in the small wooden space, breathing in incense smoke and the lingering scent of her fear, and I knew I had crossed a line I couldn't uncross. The servo skull came for me 2 days later. I was in my cell, attempting to pray, when I heard the pneumatic whir of its approach. It hovered at my door, red optical sensors fixed on me, and its Vox unit crackled to life with Cardinal Voss's synthesized voice. Report to sub-level processing immediately. I knew what that meant. Petra had reported me. Or someone had overheard. Or the confession had been monitored. They monitored some of them, randomly. Quality control for the machine. It didn't matter how they knew. What mattered was that they knew. I could have run. The cathedral was vast, and I knew its passages well. I could have disappeared into the hive, become another anonymous face in the teeming masses. But where would I go? The Imperium was infinite. The Ecclesiarchy was everywhere. And more than that, more than fear of capture, was a kind of weary curiosity. I had spent 3 years watching the machine work. Now I would experience it from the inside. There was something almost fitting about that. The descent to the Penitent facility felt longer than usual. Or perhaps time was simply moving strangely, the way it does when you're walking towards something you can't escape. When I emerged into the main chamber with its rows upon rows of cells, Father Cassius was waiting for me. His scarified face showed no emotion. "Brother," he said gently, "I'm sorry it came to this." "Are you?" I asked. "Yes," he said, and I believed him. "You were a good priest, diligent, compassionate, but compassion without wisdom is dangerous. And wisdom is knowing when to stop asking questions," I said. "Wisdom is understanding that some questions have no good answers," Cassius replied. "Come, we've prepared a cell for you." The cell was in the deepest section of the facility, past where I had worked, past even Brother Yakov's cell. This was where they kept the clergy who fell, a special section where those who had served the Imperium's spiritual machinery were processed when they themselves became grit in the gears. There were perhaps 50 cells in this section. Most were occupied. I recognized some faces, priests I had served alongside, confessors I had trained with, even one bishop whose sermons I had attended as a novice, all brought low, all awaiting processing. My cell was 2 meters square. It contained a waste bucket and nothing else. The walls were covered in scratches, previous occupants attempting to leave some mark of their existence. I would add to those scratches in time. But first, Cassius had some formalities to complete. "You are accused of heresy in the 3rd degree," he said, reading from a data slate. "Specifically, undermining the spiritual confidence of a penitent, suggesting that imperial justice is arbitrary, and implying that confession is not spiritually efficacious. Do you confess?" "To which part?" I asked. "All of it. I told a woman she didn't have to break herself for a system that didn't care about her guilt or innocence," I said. "If that's heresy, then yes, I confess." "Do you renounce this heresy?" And there it was, the question that would determine everything. I could say yes. I could tell them I was wrong, that I had been overcome by temporary weakness, that I had seen the error of my ways. They would assign penance, perhaps a year or 2 of imprisonment, some enhanced interrogation, eventual return to service in a diminished capacity. The machine would accept me back, because the machine always accepted true contrition. Or I could say no. I could refuse to renounce what I knew to be true, and I would join Brother Yakov in his endless loop of impossible mathematics, join Sarah in her slow erasure, join the millions upon millions whose names covered the chapel walls and spiraled up into darkness. "No," I said. "I don't renounce it." Cassius closed his eyes briefly. When he opened them, they were wet. "Then the Emperor have mercy on your soul." The cell door closed with a pneumatic hiss. The lock engaged, and I was alone in the dark with only my thoughts and the distant mechanical hum of the cathedral above me. The first weeks were the hardest. They fed me once a day thin protein paste and recycled water, just enough to sustain life, but never enough to satisfy hunger. The cell had no windows, no light source except the dim glow from the corridor outside. I lost track of time quickly. Days and nights became meaningless concepts. There was only hunger and thirst, and the cold that seeped up from the stone floor, and the endless silence, broken occasionally by screams from other cells. I tried to pray at first. Old habits die hard. But the prayers felt hollow now, like I was reciting words in a language I no longer understood. The Emperor protects. Did he? Protected from what? Protected how? What did protection even mean in a system designed to consume its own children? The questions circled in my mind like carrion birds, picking at the corpse of my faith. Father Cassius came to interrogate me weekly. Or perhaps it was daily. Or monthly. Time had lost coherence. He would ask the same questions. Do you confess? Do you renounce? And I would give the same answers. After a while, our sessions took on a strange intimacy. We were both playing our roles in the machine, actors in a play we'd performed 1,000 times with different faces. Why are you doing this? He asked me during one session. Or perhaps it was 100 sessions. You know how this ends. You've seen it yourself. Why not just confess? Because Sarah didn't have anyone to tell her she was right, I said. Because Brother Yakov spent 14 years believing he was alone in seeing the truth. Because someone needs to say it, even if only to these walls. The system is broken. The math doesn't work. We're grinding up souls for no purpose, except to keep the machine running. The Imperium survives, Cassius said. At what cost? Any cost, he replied. That's not cruelty. That's mathematics. Humanity survives or it doesn't. Every other consideration is secondary. Then what separates us from the things we fight? I asked. If we become monsters to fight monsters, what's left worth saving? Cassius stood to leave. At the door, he paused. You're not the first to ask that question. You won't be the last. But the question itself is a luxury built on the backs of billions who never get to ask it because they're too busy surviving. Your philosophy is beautiful, brother, but it's useless. After that session, the interrogations stopped. Or perhaps I simply stopped noticing them. Time was fully liquid now, meaningless. I began to understand how Brother Yakov had fallen into his loop. The mind, deprived of external stimulation, turned inward and began to eat itself. I would find myself reciting liturgies I thought I'd forgotten, or singing songs from childhood, or conducting elaborate conversations with people who weren't there. I discovered I could recall every face from the confessional booth with perfect clarity. All those souls who had knelt before me and confessed their sins, their fears, their doubts. I replayed their stories in the darkness, testing them against what I knew now. Had any of them been truly guilty? Had any of them deserved the suffering I had facilitated? The machine didn't care. It processed them all the same. Guilty, innocent, somewhere between it made no difference to the gears. It was during one of these mental replays that I had a realization so obvious I laughed out loud, a sound that echoed strangely in my cell. I had spent 3 years watching the machine work. I had documented its processes, learned its rhythms, understood its function. And then I had committed heresy, small, almost insignificant, and been processed exactly as I had watched others be processed. I had become a test case for my own observations. The machine was proving my thesis about itself, by demonstrating it didn't care whether I was right or wrong, only that I had deviated from acceptable parameters. This struck me as deeply funny. I couldn't stop laughing. The laughter turned to sobbing. The sobbing turned back to laughter. I don't know how long it lasted. When I finally quieted, I noticed someone was standing outside my cell. Brother Yakov. He must have been transferred. Or perhaps I had been transferred. Geography in the facility was flexible, fungible. He stood with his face pressed against the bars, his lips moving in their eternal calculation. Could have fed them all. The math was simple. Could have fed them all. Yes, I said. You could have. He stopped, looked at me, actually focused his eyes on my face, the first time I'd seen him recognize anything beyond his own internal loop. You believe me? He whispered. I believe you, I said. The math was simple. You were right. They punished you for being right. Something broke in his face. Or perhaps it was something mending. He pressed his forehead against the bars and wept, not the despairing sobs I'd heard from other penitents, but something that sounded almost like relief. After a moment, he spoke again, and this time his voice was different, clearer. I wasn't mad, he said. All these years, I thought perhaps I had been mad. The calculations seemed so obvious. but they kept telling me I was wrong. I started to believe them. "You weren't mad," I said. "The system is mad. You just noticed." "What happens now?" he asked. "Now we wait for processing," I said. "They'll turn us into servitors eventually. Probably. Unless we die first. Or unless the Imperium falls. Or unless—" I trailed off, realizing I had nothing to offer after unless. There was no escape from this. We both knew it. "I'm tired," Yakov said. "So tired." "I know." He slid down the bars until he was sitting on the corridor floor, his back against his cell. We sat like that for what might have been hours or days, two heretics waiting for the machine to finish with them. At some point, he began to talk. Not his loop anymore, but actual stories. He told me about the district he had served, the people he had tried to help, the calculations he had made showing how simple redistribution could ease their suffering. He told me about the Cardinal who had listened to his proposal with interest before having him arrested. He told me about the first 5 years of imprisonment when he had believed rescue would come, because surely someone would realize the mistake. He told me about the moment exact, precise, burned into his memory when he had understood no rescue was coming because there was no mistake to correct. The system had worked exactly as designed. I told him my story in return. The confessional booth, the penitent facility, the chapel of names, Sarah and Petra, and all the others. By the time I finished, my voice was hoarse. "Do you regret it?" Yakov asked. "Speaking out." I thought about that. "No," I said finally. "The machine processed me either way. At least this way I know why." "Small comfort," he said. "It's something," I replied. We lapsed back into silence. After a while, I heard Yakov's breathing change, deepen. He had fallen asleep sitting against the bars. I watched him sleep, this broken man who had spent 14 years clutching his truth against impossible pressure, and felt something that wasn't quite peace but was adjacent to it. We were fools, both of us. Our resistance had changed nothing. But we had resisted. That had to mean something. I don't know when exactly Father Cassius returned. Time was meaningless now. But suddenly he was there, with 2 servitors and a medical cart. He looked between Yakov and me, taking in the scene 2 heretical priests sitting in proximity, one asleep, one watching. "It's time," Cassius said quietly. "For both of us?" I asked. "For him," Cassius said, nodding toward Yakov. He finally stopped his calculations. The silence is evidence of spiritual progress. "We're proceeding with conversion." Yakov woke as the servitors opened his cell. He didn't struggle, just looked at me one last time and said, "The math was simple." "I know," I said. "I'll remember." They took him away. I never saw him again, but I kept my promise. In the darkness of my cell, I ran his calculations in my head, testing them against what I knew of Imperial logistics and resource distribution. And he was right. The math was simple. It would have worked. The suffering was unnecessary. The Imperium chose cruelty not because it was required, but because cruelty was the point. A population in constant pain was easier to control than a population with time to think. After they took Yakov, something changed in the facility. I began to hear less screaming, fewer interrogations. The cells around me emptied one by one as their occupants were processed for conversion. I realized I was being saved for last. Some final test, perhaps, or just bureaucratic inefficiency. I had been tagged as requiring special attention, and the paperwork hadn't yet caught up. Then Cardinal Voss came to visit me. I don't know how long I had been imprisoned. Months? Years? My body had wasted significantly. I could feel ribs through my skin, see veins standing out on my hands like rivers on a map. But my mind was relatively clear, relatively intact. I had found a rhythm in the darkness, a way of existing that required minimal energy. I was conserving myself for some purpose I couldn't quite articulate. The Cardinal stood outside my cell, his augmetic eyes clicking and whirring as they focused on me. He held a data slate in his mechanical hands. You've proven remarkably resistant to processing, he said. His synthesized voice echoed strangely in the corridor. Most clergy break within 6 months. You've been here for 23 months and 17 days. Nearly 2 years. That seemed impossible, but also entirely plausible. What happens now? I asked. My voice was rusty from disuse. That depends on you, Voss said. I've reviewed your case thoroughly. Read transcripts of your interrogations, examined your service record, and I've come to offer you a choice. What choice? Renounce your heresy and return to service, or continue your current course towards servitor conversion, he said. Father Cassius tells me you've been surprisingly coherent in isolation. That suggests your mind remains salvageable. The Ecclesiarchy has use for priests who can think, even priests who think dangerously, within constraints. I stared at him. Why? Because you were correct, Voss said simply. The words hung in the corridor like a physical presence. I must have made some sound because Voss continued, not about everything, but about the fundamental mathematics of the system. Yes, it's inefficient. Yes, it causes unnecessary suffering. Yes, it processes innocent and guilty without meaningful distinction. You observed the machine accurately. Then why? I whispered. If you know it's broken, why continue? Because the alternative is worse, Voss said. He gestured with the data slate toward the empty cells around us. Every soul processed through this facility represents a potential vector for systemic collapse. Doubt spreads like infection. Questions breed more questions. If we allowed every reasonable objection to the system's cruelties, the entire edifice would fracture. Humanity would tear itself apart in civil war within a generation. The Xenos would sweep through our scattered remnants. Chaos would claim whatever remained. The machine is cruel, but it keeps us alive. At what cost? I asked, echoing my earlier question to Cassius. Any cost, Voss replied. Because extinction is worse than suffering. Always, without exception. Your ancestor, I said. Priest Malcolm Voss. He asked similar questions. The machine processed him too. For the first time, something like emotion flickered across the Cardinal's augmetic features. I know. I read his case file when I became Cardinal. Do you know what his final words were? Recorded in the interrogation transcripts? I shook my head. Tell my descendants to ask better questions, Voss said. I asked the wrong ones. I hope they learn from my failure. What were the right questions? I asked. Not, why is the system cruel, but how do we survive the universe's cruelty? Voss said. Not, how do we end suffering, but how do we make suffering meaningful? Your questions were too small, brother. Too focused on individual justice. The Imperium operates at scales, where individual justice becomes rounding error. So I should accept the machine? I'm asking you to work within it, while understanding its limitations, Voss said. Father Cassius tells me you altered theological texts during your service. Small changes, easily missed. Do you know what I did when I discovered this? No. I filed them correctly in the archives, he said. Those texts will sit unread for centuries. But perhaps, someday, some other young priest will find them. Will see your small mutations. Will know that someone questioned. That might matter, or it might not. But it's better than becoming a servitor whose only contribution is lifting heavy objects for 50 years before mechanical failure. He extended the data slate toward me. Confess, renounce, return to service. Continue your small rebellions within the machine's constraints. It's more than most achieve. I looked at the data slate, looked at the Cardinal, looked at the empty cells stretching away into darkness, thought about Brother Yakov, now a servitor somewhere, his beautiful calculations lost forever, thought about Sarah and her daughter, thought about the millions of names spiraling up the chapel walls. No, I said. Voss lowered the data slate. You understand what you're refusing? Yes. Why? Because someone needs to say no, I said. Not because it changes anything. not because it matters in any measurable way, but because the machine should not have complete compliance. There should be grit in the gears, even if it's just me, even if I'm ground down to nothing. Someone should refuse. Voss was silent for a long moment. Then he nodded slowly. "My ancestor would be proud of you," he said, "and furious at your foolishness." He turned to leave, then paused. "One more thing. Your alterations to the texts, I didn't just file them correctly. I copied them, distributed the copies to 17 different cathedrals across the sector. Your small heresy is now multiplied across hundreds of archives. Perhaps someone will find them someday. Perhaps not. But they exist." He left before I could respond. The servo skull that accompanied him lingered for a moment, its optical sensors fixed on me. Then it too departed, leaving me alone in the darkness with this strange gift from a man who understood everything I had seen and had chosen differently. The final processing came 3 days later, or perhaps it was 3 weeks. Time had lost all meaning. The servitors came with their medical cart, their augmetic limbs clicking and whirring, and I didn't resist as they secured me to the gurney. Father Cassius accompanied them. He walked beside the gurney as they wheeled me through the facility, up through levels I had worked in, past the chapel of names where I had spent so many hours reading the dead. "Do you want last rites?" Cassius asked quietly. "No," I said. "I don't think the Emperor and I are on speaking terms anymore." "He hears regardless," Cassius said, "whether you speak or not. Then he already knows what I think." We reached the surgical preparation chamber. White walls, bright lumens, the smell of disinfectant and sacred oils. The servitors began their work shaving my head, marking my skull for opening, measuring me for augmetic integration. The process was mechanical, efficient, devoid of malice or mercy. Just another procedure. Just another soul being processed. Cassius stood where I could see him. "I'm sorry," he said again. "Don't be," I replied. "This was my choice." "Was it?" he asked. "Or did the machine force it? Does it matter?" "I don't know," he admitted. The surgical servitor approached with the anesthetic injector. I felt the cold kiss of metal against my throat. Cassius leaned close and whispered something I almost didn't hear. "Your name will be inscribed in the chapel, and I'll read it every night. 100 minimum, never more than 200. Someone will remember you questioned." Then the chemicals hit my bloodstream and consciousness began to fragment. My last coherent thought, before everything dissolved into blessed nothing, was about Brother Yakov and his impossible mathematics, the calculations that had sustained him through 14 years of imprisonment, the simple truth that the machine had punished him for seeing. Could have fed them all. The math was simple. Could have fed them all. And in the spiraling darkness as the anesthetic dragged me down, I held on to that thought like a prayer. Not to the Emperor, not to any god. Just to the simple, terrible, beautiful truth that the suffering was unnecessary, that better was possible, that someone had noticed, that someone had cared enough to refuse. The math was simple. The machine was wrong. And somewhere, in 17 cathedrals across the sector, my small heresies waited in the archives like seeds in frozen ground. Perhaps they would never sprout, perhaps no one would ever find them. But they existed. That was something. That had to be something. The darkness took me then, and I let it. The machine had won, as it always won, but I had made it work for the victory. I had gummed up the gears, just a little, just enough to matter, even if only to me. In the Emperor's name, I had become a heretic, and in becoming a heretic, I had found something the Imperium could never process out of me, the stubborn, futile, absolutely necessary conviction that witnessing cruelty required objection, even when objection was meaningless. Especially then, the math was simple. Someone had to say no. I had said no. And that, in the end, was enough.